Tobin Grubb sat hunched at the edge of the long dining table, his broad shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world rested upon them. The grand hall of Hallowmere Academy buzzed faintly with the chatter of students finishing their supper, their voices blending into a dull hum that Tobin barely registered. His thick fingers toyed nervously with the frayed hem of his cloak, the coarse fabric worn thin from years of anxious fidgeting. Strands of sandy hair fell into his eyes, obscuring his view as he stole quick, furtive glances at Edric Vane and Lila Pinch, who sat across from him, engrossed in a hushed conversation. Outside, a storm raged, its thunderous booms rattling the enchanted ceiling high above. The sound was muted by the Academy's ancient stone walls, but it still sent a shiver down Tobin's spine. He hated storms, hated the way they echoed the wild, untamed fury of Bone Lake, the vast, dark expanse that cradled Hallowmere in its watery depths. 2 years ago, that lake had nearly claimed him. It had been a routine lesson on aquatic charms, one of those brisk autumn days when the water shimmered with deceptive calm. Tobin, never a strong swimmer, had fumbled his incantation. The charm meant to keep him buoyant had fizzled out mid-cast, and he'd slipped beneath the surface. The memory was as vivid as if it had happened yesterday. The icy grip of the water, the silence that swallowed all sound, the weight pressing down on his chest as his lungs screamed for air. Panic had clawed at him, wild and desperate, his limbs thrashing uselessly against the current. He'd been certain he would die, until Edric Vane, with his quick wit and quicker wand, had cast a bubble charm, encasing Tobin in a shimmering sphere of air and hauling him back to the surface. That day had forged an unspoken debt between them, one Tobin carried like a stone in his heart. Now, Edric wanted to go beneath the lake, into the West Passage, no less. A forbidden corridor whispered about in dormitory tales, a place said to house secrets older than Hallowmere itself. Tobin's stomach twisted at the thought. He wasn't like Edric, all bold grins and boundless energy, nor like Lila, with her sharp mind and quiet confidence. He was just Tobin, the boy who ate too much bread, who flinched at sudden noises, who'd rather spend his days kneading dough in the kitchens than chasing mysteries in the dark. But Edric had saved his life, and when Edric had turned to him with that earnest look and asked for his help, Tobin hadn't been able to say no, even if every fiber of his being screamed at him to stay away from the lake. He glanced at the tin box Edric cradled in his hands. Its surface was etched with runes that glowed faintly in the flickering lantern light, casting strange shadows across the table. Inside it lay a key, small, silver, and pulsing with an energy Tobin couldn't begin to comprehend. Edric swore it had come to him in a dream, a vision of water and shadow, and a voice that whispered of hidden truths. Tobin didn't understand it. He didn't want to understand it, but he trusted Edric, and he trusted Lila, whose steady presence was like an anchor in a storm. Still, the idea of descending into the lake's depths, where the water could crush you, where the darkness hid things with teeth and tentacles, made his skin crawl and his palms sweat. "Oi, Tobin!" Edric's voice cut through the fog of his thoughts, sharp and teasing. "You're not backing out, are you?" Tobin blinked, startled, and realized he'd been staring blankly at the half-eaten roll of bread in his hand. Crumbs dusted his lap, and he brushed them off hastily. "No," he stammered, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Just thinking about what might be down there." Lila leaned forward, her hazel eyes softening behind the round lenses of her glasses. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat braid, and there was a smudge of ink on her cheek, and a remnant of her afternoon spent poring over rune charts. "It's okay to be scared, Tobin," she said gently. "We all are, in our own ways, but we'll be together." Her words were warm, soothing, like the first sip of tea on a cold morning. They didn't untie the knot of dread in his chest, but they loosened it just enough for him to breathe. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "Yeah," he managed at last. "Together." Edric clapped him on the back, the force of it nearly knocking Tobin into his plate. "You're tougher than you think, Tobin," he said, his grin wide and bright, his blue eyes glinting with mischief. "Remember that time you faced down a rampaging Grindylow in Charms class? Didn't even flinch." Tobin snorted, the memory tugging a reluctant laugh from him. "Only because I was too terrified to move." "Still counts," Edric shot back, winking. "Bravery's not about being fearless. It's about doing what you have to, even when your knees are shaking and your heart's pounding like a drum." Tobin chewed on that for a moment, his fingers tightening around the roll of bread until it crumbled in his grip. Maybe Edric had a point. Maybe courage wasn't about never feeling afraid. It was about pushing through the fear, step by trembling step. He'd faced the lake once before and lived to tell the tale. Maybe he could do it again. The grand hall began to empty as students trickled out, their footsteps echoing off the high stone walls. The enchanted ceiling rippled with flashes of lightning, painting the room in stark whites and deep grays. But the trio lingered at their table, their voices dropping to conspiratorial whispers as they hashed out their plan. Pippa Tuttle, red-haired, reckless, and always eager for a bit of chaos, had agreed to create a diversions in the East Wing. Knowing Pippa, it would be something loud, messy, and likely involving an explosion of glitter or a swarm of enchanted paper birds. Tobin's job was simpler, but no less vital. He'd keep watch while Edric and Lila tackled the door to the West Passage. If anyone approached, he'd signal them with a low whistle. 2 short bursts, sharp and clear. It wasn't the stuff of legends, but it mattered, and Tobin felt a small spark of pride at being trusted with it. Still, doubt gnawed at him like a persistent rat. What if something went wrong? What if the guardians Lila had read about, ancient sentinels carved from stone and magic, were more than they could handle? What if the lake itself turned against them, its waters rising to swallow them whole? His mind spun with possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. He pictured slimy tentacles bursting from the depths, or runes that triggered curses when touched. He imagined the air growing thin, the walls closing in, the cold seeping into his bones until he couldn't move, couldn't scream. "Tobin?" Lila's voice pulled him back, soft but firm. "You're doing it again!" He blinked, his cheeks flushing. "Doing what?" "Overthinking," she said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "I can practically hear the gears grinding in your head." Edric chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "She's right, mate. You've got that look, like you're picturing a kraken dragging us all to the bottom." Tobin ducked his head, embarrassed. "Maybe not a kraken," he muttered, "but something bad." Lila reached across the table, her hand resting briefly on his. Her touch was cool and steady, grounding him. "We've planned for this," she said. "I've studied the runes, Edric's got the key, and you're our eyes. We're ready." Her confidence bolstered him, if only a little. He glanced at Edric, whose grin hadn't faltered, then at Lila, whose calm certainty was unshakable. They were his friends. More than that, they were his family in every way that mattered. Edric had pulled him from the lake's grasp, and Lila had spent countless nights by the dormitory fire, patiently explaining charm theory until it clicked. They'd shared laughter over burnt biscuits, groaned together over Professor Mallow's endless essays, and once spent an entire detention scrubbing cauldrons after Pippa's prank went awry. If they believed in him, maybe he could find it in himself to believe too. "All right," Edric said, snapping Tobin back to the moment. "Pippa's set for lights out. We meet at Waterclock Tower, then head to the West Passage. Lila's handling the runes, and, Tobin, you're our lookout. Got it?" Tobin nodded, his mouth dry as parchment. "Got it." Lila squeezed his hand one last time before letting go. "We'll be fine, Tobin. I promise." Her promise hung in the air, warm and solid. Tobin managed a small smile, though his pulse still thrummed in his ears. "Yeah," he echoed. "We'll be fine." As they rose to leave, the storm outside unleashed a particularly fierce clap of thunder, the ceiling shimmering with jagged streaks of light. Tobin's heart jolted, but he squared his shoulders, falling into step beside his friends. The adventure loomed ahead, dark and uncertain, and though fear still clawed at him, he refused to let it take root. Not tonight. The dormitory was still as Tobin lay on his bunk, staring up at the shadowed ceiling. The floating lanterns had dimmed to a faint golden glow, their light dancing across the rough stone walls in soft, shifting patterns. The snores of his roommates, deep and rhythmic from Barty, high and whistling from Felix, filled the room, but they did little to ease the tension coiling in his chest. He clutched his bread pouch, a small canvas sack stuffed with rolls he'd swiped from supper, its familiar weight a tether to something safe and ordinary. When the lanterns flickered twice, the signal for lights out, Tobin slipped from his bed, his boots whispering against the floor. He moved carefully, avoiding the creaky board by Barty's bunk, and eased the dormitory door open just enough to slip through. The mist corridor stretched before him, its enchanted fog swirling around his ankles, cool and damp against his skin. The air carried the faint tang of salt and the earthy scent of wet stone, remnants of the lake that surrounded them. Tobin pulled his cloak tighter, his breath puffing out in small clouds as he hurried toward Waterclock Tower. Edric and Lila were already waiting when he arrived, their figures illuminated by the faint silver glow of the key in Edric's hand. Lila's wand was tucked into her belt, its tip emitting a soft shimmer, while Edric's restless energy crackled like the storm overhead. Tobin's stomach fluttered, a mix of nerves and cold, but he forced himself to nod in greeting. "Pippa's distraction should hit any second," Edric whispered, his voice low and urgent. "Let's move." They turned down the narrow passage leading to the West Passage, the walls tightening around them as they went. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing against Tobin's chest like a warning. The runes carved into the stone pulsed faintly, their light sinking with the rapid beat of his heart, and the key in Edric's hand glowed brighter with every step, as if drawn to whatever lay ahead. The corridor ended at a door, small, plain, yet etched with runes that shimmered like molten silver. Tobin's breath caught as Edric raised the key, its own runes flaring in response. The lock clicked with a sound like breaking ice, and the door swung open, revealing a spiral staircase that plunged into darkness. A whisper rose from the depths, faint and chilling. "The key bearer will unlock the truth." Tobin's knees trembled, but he swallowed hard, forcing his voice steady. "I'll keep watch," he said. "Go on." Edric clapped him on the shoulder, his grin fierce and wild. "You've got this, Tobin." With that, Edric and Lila stepped onto the staircase, their silhouettes swallowed by the shadows. Tobin stood alone, his back pressed to the cold stone wall, his eyes darting down the corridor. The silence was thick, broken only by the distant drip of water and the storm's muffled snarls. He clutched his bread pouch tighter, his fingers shaking, and settled in to wait. Time stretched thin, each minute a test of his nerve. His mind conjured nightmares from the depths, tentacles coiling up the stairs, ancient voices cursing their names, the lake itself rising to drown them all. He shoved the thoughts down, focusing instead on Edric's grin, Lila's calm, the trust they'd placed in him. They needed him to hold this pod, to keep them safe. He couldn't falter now. A sudden noise shattered the quiet, a faint clatter, like stone on stone, echoing from the corridor's far end. Tobin's heart slammed into his ribs. He strained to listen, holding his breath as the sound grew louder, closer. Footsteps. Someone was coming. Panic surged, hot and sharp, but he clung to his role. He pursed his lips and let out a low whistle, 2 short bursts as they'd agreed. The footsteps hesitated, then sped up, heading straight for him. Tobin's pulse roared in his ears. He had to act, had to keep whoever it was away from the door. Steeling himself, he stepped into the corridor, his voice trembling but loud. Hey, who's there? A figure emerged from the shadows. Jilly Weaver, her blonde braids swinging, her green eyes narrowing as they landed on him. Grubbs? She said, her tone sharp with suspicion. What are you doing here? Tobin's mind went blank, but he forced a grin, holding up his bread pouch like a shield. Just grabbing a midnight snack, he said, praying his voice didn't crack. Couldn't sleep. Gilly's gaze flicked to the pouch, then back to his face, her smirk cutting. In the west corridor, alone? I like the quiet, Tobin said, the lie tasting bitter on his tongue. Helps me think. She stepped closer, her boots clicking on the stone, her eyes boring into his. You're a terrible liar, Grubbs. What are you really up to? Sweat beaded on his palms, but he held her stare, willing his face not to betray him. Nothing, he said. Just wandering. For a long moment, she studied him, her silence heavier than the lake above. Then, with a huff, she turned on her heel. Fine, she snapped. But if I catch you sneaking around again, I'll drag you to Mallow myself. Tobin nodded, his knees weak with relief. Sure thing, Gilly. As her footsteps faded into the mist, Tobin sagged against the wall, his breath coming in shaky gasps. He'd done it. He'd kept her away. It wasn't much, but it swelled in his chest like an ember of pride. Minutes later, or perhaps hours, time had lost all meaning. Edric and Lila emerged from the staircase, their faces pale, but alight with triumph. Edric clutched a black book, its cover etched with glowing runes, while Lila's eyes sparkled with barely contained excitement. We got it, Edric whispered, his grin wide enough to split his face. Let's go. Tobin nodded, falling into step beside them as they hurried back through the mist-shrouded corridors. The storm still howled outside, its fury shaking the walls. But within Tobin, a quiet warmth took root. He'd faced his fear, stood his ground, and kept his friends safe. Maybe, just maybe, he was braver than he'd ever dared to believe.